Hey, members, just wanted to thank you and drop you some content here. This is from the Lex Friedman podcast, and this is a psychiatrist named Paul Conti who is speaking specifically about evil, envy, and kind of like leadership in World War II and the psychology surrounding the mindset of these dictators like Hitler and Stalin. And I thought it was the best podcast I've ever seen describing the psychology of Hitler. And it is a real treat. So I'm going to try to break it up and cut out all the, in between stuff for you guys and just give you the meat of the conversation here. But it's really good. So stick to the end.
Or I want what you have, right? I mean, there's so much of this, and I understand it's driven by scarcity and by human insecurity and envy and all of these things that I think could drive us towards destruction. But all of that recklessness comes from not having this initial appreciation and respect that you're referring to and just marveling at, like, wow, okay, we're here. That's amazing. Let's start with that.
But if we marvel at this whole thing, the human project, the human condition, all the different kinds of human beings that are possible, what do you then make of that some humans do evil onto the world? First of all, are all human beings capable of evil? If we're in the process, now we've got a little bit of momentum in terms of marveling at the layers of the cake. Should we also marvel at the capacity for evil in all of us?
Yes.
Is that capacity there?
I believe that it is. Yes.
So what do we understand about the psychology of evil? Where does that originate in the human mind? Is it there in the neurobiology? Is it there in the environment, in the upbringing?
Can I clarify first? I think the capacity for evil, I do believe, is in all of us. There's a difference between enacting evil and a sort of preset, followed, developed plan of evil, right? I don't believe that all of us are capable of doing what the people who perpetrate the most evil do. Right. But I do believe that we're capable of perpetrating evil. Right. And one thought would be that there are drives in us. I mean, there certainly seem to be drives in us towards survival, towards gratification, in some ways towards pleasure. And that can get very complicated because pleasure inside can be relief of distress. So if I feel very badly about myself, and I can feel a little better about myself by making you feel worse about yourself, right? Which that plays out in a lot of human beings. Is that an indirect way of bringing pleasure, right? So
this concept of getting pleasure to relieve pain inside of yourself, basically he's going to bring it back to childhood and childhood trauma or trauma in general. And he's going to speak specifically about Hitler. And just to give you some context, Hitler was raised by a father who was very abusive. Hitler was always kind of in this fringe state where he wanted to be German, but he was not. He was Austrian, and he was trying to get German citizenship. And he joined World War I and eventually got German citizenship by being a veteran. But he also survived 4 years of World War I, which again causes more trauma. And then from all that trauma, I suppose you could get into this incremental kind of snowball effect where then you feel like you need to prove yourself because you lost the war, your dad abused you, and all your friends died in the war. So let's continue on listening to this excellent conversation.
It gets very complicated what's going on inside of us. And sometimes the perpetration of evil things can be through misunderstandings, anger, impulsivity. I mean, there are things that we can have in us, and other times there can be other things going on which are through the lens of unhealthy human psychology. So, for example, the psychology of envy, which I think drives the lion's share of the orchestrated evil, right? There's a difference between impulsive, reflexive evil and highly orchestrated evil, which I think is driven by envy.
Highly orchestrated evil, are we talking about a scale of societies like totalitarianism? So if we're thinking about somebody like Hitler, so at scale, orchestration of evil, envy driving that. So, I mean,
Yeah.
that's really interesting to think about. I'd love to hear more about it. So, some of it, there might be some psychological forces that are in tension with each other. So, one is if you look at somebody like Hitler, it's difficult to know what was going on in his mind, but it's possible to imagine if you just look at dictators throughout history that he thought he was doing good, not just for himself, but for the people he believed have value.
So basically, I get to pause it here because after the World War One in the Germany lost the war, you basically have the Treaty of Versailles, and this, of course, would cause a lot of envy after the trauma of World War One. So you have a guy who's really good at speaking and a populace that has been through a lot of trauma and now has to go through reparations and economic collapse. And this would obviously make anyone envious. So you have the powder keg kind of set. All you need is the fuse. And Hitler was just the right person at the right time to light that fuse.
So one way you can achieve what we consider as evil is by devaluing some group of people. And that could be all group of people. So it could have sort of a narcissistic type of idea that you basically don't care about other human beings. That's one. Envy is different. I mean, maybe they can collaborate together, or even like you mentioned, you can actually enjoy doing bad to others. That's almost like different, because if all it is like narcissism, you disregard, you don't care how others feel, then you can just make cold, calculated, military, almost economic decisions, and you don't care if 1 million people die here or there. But if you actually enjoy some aspect of that, or there is like a resentment that fuels it, it's not just cold calculation. It's like fueled by some kind of personal or cultural resentment.
So I think it's
that's
all
different.
fueled by that.
You think so?
I think it's all fueled by that. I think the idea that, say, Hitler thought he was doing good, right, is like, that is such a thin facade that it flies away like a handkerchief in a hurricane, right? That.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Wow, that's beautiful. Yeah,
it's built upon, like, it says, I'll explain, logical lies, right? Because people can build lies upon specious logic, right? So the idea that, okay, I am doing good because I believe that this ethnicity of people is good and this is bad, and now I'm going to do this and I'm going to make the world different and it's going to bring better to the world, and now I'm raising armies and I'm building concentration camps, and I think like this is all in the service of good. Is I don't think anyone ever thinks that, right? Or they think that, but because they're living in the surface patina, right? Like they're not allowing the hurricane in that blows away the handkerchief and says like this is all evil, right? I mean, how do you decide that some group of people is good and some is bad? And like, what is it that you take upon yourself to play God or make decisions about the world? And I think what really is going on is that people are not doing that, right? There's something cobbled together to say like, why this is right and this is okay, right? And this is even good, right? But it is all a lie, right? It's a lie that's adorning what I believe is the fact. I believe that what's going on is the gratification of envy inside of the person. And whether someone says, oh, I think this is good and it's okay if 1 million people die, or I'm going to enjoy that 1 million people die, I think is the same. I think the enjoyment, the gratification of the orchestrated evil is there, and that it all.
So I'm going to pause here. And what I think he's talking about is like the Freudian concept of the id, ego, and superego. And the ego is basically, I think, where he's talking about where the justification of all these evil things come from, because you had the trauma, you had the loss, you had the envy. And then to take that a step further, the ego is fueled by these things because we have to make this right. And he should get into it a little bit later, but basically the ego is there so that, you know, you basically don't get so depressed in life that, this is going to be pretty serious, but so that you don't commit suicide, you keep on going, basically. So if you've had all this trauma and envy, and then it's enough trauma and envy to make you not want to live life anymore, that's where the ego kicks in to give you that drive to keep on going. But things get kind of warped and twisted if you don't sort that ego out consciously. And you can do this through many ways. Like, I think later in this episode, he talks about therapy and things like that and how people aren't getting enough help. But basically, unless you intervene yourself, it's going to be incredibly hard to sort your ego out. And you can take these steps in the wrong direction to eventually start to perpetrate evil because your ego justifies everything step by step by step. So I think this is incredibly insightful. Let's continue on.
All comes from vulnerability and insecurity. It all comes from deficits in the sense of self.
My slow Pentium PC is processing that. So envy underlies all of it. The psychological concept of envy. What is that? I keep putting myself in the mind of Hitler, I guess. That has nothing to do, it doesn't have to do with Jews or Slavic people. Does it have to do with specific amorphous other in his mind that he's envious of?
I think it has all to do with him. All to do with him. There's not a love of the people with whom he allied, or even a sense that the people who he persecuted were worse than him. It's all projections out of what was going on inside of him, which was an intense sense of inadequacy, a rage at being someone he perceived as lesser than. That's the difference between, so we can define words in different ways, even within psychology, but let's say we take the definition here of sort of jealousy as being sort of benign, right? The idea that, I might see something that you have that I don't, and I might think, I'd like that. Maybe I'll work harder to get it, right? Or maybe I can't get it. Maybe it's that you're younger than I am. They say, okay, you have that and I don't. I mean, I have other things too. I'm okay anyway. But I might want those things, but it's very benign, the jealousy. I'd like to be younger. I'd like to be richer, whatever it is that we people think, right? But it's just a thought, and it's a thought that can result in strivings or acceptance, right? It's very, very different. It's completely different than envy, which is destructive. It's the thought of, I see something that you have that I don't have, right? And instead of me working for it or accepting that I don't have it, what I'd like to do then is bring you down, take you down to where I am, and then I'll feel better, right? Because from the perspective of envy, it is all relative.
So is jealousy a kind of, is it, because he said completely different, but is jealousy potentially like a gateway drug to envy? Like, is it a slippery slope?
I think no. I think that jealousy is a natural, just part of the human phenomenon that we go through life, and we see like, I'd like to have that. I think it's probably part of our incentives, right? If I'm farming and I have one row of crops and I look over and I see that you're working harder and you have two, and I'd like to have two, that can make me work harder to have two.
You don't think it's a slippery slope from one to the other? To at first you're like, I'd like to work harder, but then you keep failing and the weather sucks and you keep failing and the other person becomes more successful. Plus he's got a new hot wife now. There's a nice tractor. Does it feel is all working? And then you get this idea that, you know what, I'm going to steal all his stuff. I'm going to murder him. And that, don't you think that's just like a leap?
No, I actually
of
think
the same
no.
phenomenon?
No.
Eventually, Lex discards what Paul Conti is saying here, and he does feel that jealousy leads into envy. So I kind of do side with Lex here that jealousy can turn into envy. But Paul Conti thinks they're completely separate, that he sees jealousy, he defines it as a human instinct, but that does not feed into the greater psychological structure of envy. But, I could see where jealousy starts off and could eventually become envy. But my point is, for myself, when I feel that the natural human reaction of jealousy, I try to suppress that, because I know the end game of that is there is no end game. There is just another country to conquer. Look at Hitler. Look at Napoleon. You just keep on having to conquer the next foe because you've pissed off so many people that everyone's going to turn against you. And then there's an endless amount of things that you could be jealous about, or people that have things that are better than you. So you got to reel yourself in somehow. And that goes back into the concept of weighing and measuring your ego, and then trying to correct your ego and just be at peace with things instead of constantly wanting. So let's continue on here.
because I think there are things that are in us as humans, right? So the things are just by being human, like we can, for example, feel compassion, right? We can feel interest, right? We can feel jealousy in that benign sense. Like it's all part of just being human. If we start going from, hey, you have more crops than I have, and now it seems like I actually have a better life in a lot of ways than I have, I'm going to kill you. That is not a progression of something benign, right? That is.
But wait a minute. But that is a human leap of the same thing, isn't it? Is because you're drawing a line, stuff you're saying like this human stuff, it's regular life, it's benign, but it feels like this benign thing is just a low magnitude thing version of the thing that's not benign. Like there's probably a gray area where it stops being benign. Like jealousy, you can have like healthy jealousy, you can have a little bit slightly unhealthy. That's I think Jealous Guy, this John Lennon song that I love, is just beautiful. I mean, there's like this jealousy inside relationships can make you feel like could take your minds in all kinds of silly directions, and it's crazy. But like it feels like that's a next door neighbor to like being really crazy and toxic and all that kind of stuff inside relationships. And then that feels like a next door neighbor. It's like an apartment building. That feels like a next door neighbor that eventually gets to Hitler with envy and resentment of an entire population of people.
You're right in that there's a causal.
Yeah.
There can be a causal chain, right? Like if I'm not feeling jealous, maybe I won't ever feel envious, right? So you can see, okay, so it can kind of lead to, it can open gates to, like how much do I dislike that you have things that I don't have, right? So yes, in that sense, and I think this is the part that I think is so important, that I think there is a disjunction, right? There's an asymptotic shift, right, from one thing to another, because
now you're speaking my language mathematically.
Yeah.
Asymptotic leap. Yep.
Yes, it's a way to convey, right, something that's entirely different. Because if I start thinking I'm not going to try and make things better, right, I'd like instead to harm you, that's qualitatively different, right? They're saying, hey, there can be seeds of evil in all of us. Let me take that seed out, dust it off, plant it, nurture it,
Yeah.
right, and then grow that seed of evil, which will affect all other parts of the person's life, right? They won't behave the same towards others in their life. They'll become different as they nurture fantasies of evil, as they begin to create inside of themselves the motivation and the will, right, to enact evil, right? I mean, the Hitler analogy would say, look, you take someone who had a bad childhood, right, who like was not loved, who was taught and told that he was less than. Okay, like that. We know that happens. I mean, that's why child abuse is so evil, right? It's telling children the worst possible wrong lessons, right? They're not good enough. They'll always be hurt. They can't keep themselves safe. They don't deserve safety, right? So then you take someone who then nurtures that seed of evil, which is a choice. And says, well, I can't paint well enough, and no one appreciates me, and I don't like how I look, and I don't fit in with the people I want to fit in with, and then and on and on and on and on and on. And there's a hatred of self through that lens of misery, of just being repulsed by the self. But that's unacceptable to the self. So, it has to be someone else's fault.
No, I do think that he is speaking specifically about Hitler, even though he didn't say that he was, because of the painter reference. And yeah, like I said before, Hitler was definitely abused by his father.
Right? It's not my fault. Whose fault is it? Right? And then you see en masse the enaction of evil towards groups of people who somehow in this person's mind, right, are responsible for his misery. And there's the justification of evil. And then all the, whether it's this will be better for the economy, this will be good, this will be that, like that's all lies built to justify the evil.
Those are surface level narratives.
Yes.
And the envy is the deep down mechanism that enables.
And that's the endpoint that's being served. What's being served is destruction, right? Which is why it always brings more destruction, right? I mean, how many times do wars that were started for purposes that we would look and say like that those were evil purposes? Like how many times does good come of that? Even if we look at the modern world, what comes of it is more evil, is more destruction. You know, Hitler's outward destruction eventually came inward, and you see pictures of what Berlin looked like after the Second World War, right? It wasn't just destruction perpetrated outward, as awful as that is. It's catchy, right? Like people used to worry if during the time of the Manhattan Project, right? If you start this chain reaction, will you blow the whole world up, right? Or will it stop within this bomb or not? And we see, okay, the chain reaction of evil hasn't yet blown the whole world up, but look at how the catastrophe spreads. You think 50 to 60 million people dead in the Second World War, which truly was a world war. What destruction was spread around the globe?
And this is something that can't be stopped once the chain reaction starts. Like if Hitler was successful, like it would just keep going.
If he had been, think about if
on his
just
personal psychological level, I mean.
right? Because if we think from the perspective of destruction, success would have led to the need to conquer more. Then there's factions and infighting, and then eventually you get the same mass destruction, right? And never does the inaction of evil satisfy what the person is initially seeking. Like people want to feel better about themselves, right? Like Winnicott, who was a British pediatrician who wrote about children and adults from very deep perspectives. He wrote about the idea of good enough, right? And you can sort of extrapolate that to like, we all want to feel good enough, like not just limp over the line good enough, but I want to feel good enough that I'm a decent person in the world and like what I do matters. And I can have an impact on people, and people can like me and care about me. There's a simplicity there that people want that when people don't have, and there's certain other factors, maybe they're temperamental factors or historical factors, can lead to trying to soothe that deficit, right, through envy. And I think it starts with that, and it often starts in childhood, not always, but it often starts in childhood when the child's brain and psychology are so vulnerable, and you see salient child abuse. If you look at what was Hitler's background and what was Stalin's background, and I mean you could look at almost anyone who's perpetrated evil, whether they're serial killers or whatever it may be. The majority, not everyone, but the majority had these lessons in childhood that said you're not good enough, you can't keep yourself safe, no one cares about you, and in a subset of people, that's going to generate envy, and that seed of evil then gets planted and nurtured.
That's going to be it for this clip. Thank you guys for being members again. I think that this accurately describes what I've been searching for years and years, which is to accurately describe what happened with Hitler in World War II. And this psychologist, Paul Conti, has obviously put a lot of thought into it, and I feel like it really filled some of the missing puzzle pieces for me. And the fact that it was all about Hitler, it was all about Stalin, and it was all about their psychology really makes sense. And then the milieu was set by the First World War with the populace being so downtrodden after the war, after the communist revolutions, et cetera, it set the stage for these things to occur and these types of people to get into power, hold power. And let me tell you, there was probably a lot of men like this out there. So if it wasn't Hitler, if it wasn't Stalin, if it wasn't Mao, it was probably going to be someone else. So I hope you enjoyed this excerpt. It was really enlightening to me, and I just wanted to share it with you. Thanks again, and I'll see you on the next one.